October 1944. Dawn breaks slowly over the western edge of Germania. Thin fog rolls across the jagged rows of dragon's teeth, the massive concrete anti-tank blocks of the Siegfried Line. The air is cold, silent, heavy with the smell of damp earth and burnt cordite. Inside reinforced pillboxes, German soldiers grip their rifles tightly, listening to distant rumbling beyond the mist. They've heard engines before. They've heard artillery before. But this sound is different, deeper, heavier, unbroken. A young German sentry presses his ear to the steel door, trembling as the vibrations grow stronger. And then they emerge, American Sherman tanks, dozens of them, pushing through the fog in tight formation. Some carry dozer blades, shoving aside obstacles that were supposed to stop any invasion cold. Others advance behind plumes of smoke, firing at bunkers that once felt invincible. The Germans stare in disbelief. These defenses, Hitler's unbreakable wall, were built to hold for months. Yet the Shermans are already inside the perimeter, already breaking line, already rewriting what German troops believed was impossible. The sound of cracking concrete echoes across the battlefield. The Siegfried Line is no longer a wall. It is becoming a doorway. The Siegfried Line, known in Germany as the West Wall, was more than a defensive structure. It was a symbol, a promise, a psychological barrier meant to convince German troops and civilians that no enemy army would ever set foot inside the Reich. Stretching nearly 400 miles from the Dutch border to Switzerland, the line consisted of more than 18,000 bunker, pillboxes, tunnels, anti-tank ditches, and the iconic dragon's teeth that jetted from the earth like the spine of some buried beast. Construction began in the late 1930s, driven by Hitler's determination to fortify the western frontier. As Germany prepared for expansion in the east, the propaganda was relentless. The West Wall was impregnable, a modern fortress equal to or greater than France's Maginot Line. Even as German losses mounted after Normandy and the drive across France, many soldiers still believed the Siegfried Line would stop the Allies cold. Yet reality was different. When American forces approached the German border in September 1944, the war had shifted dramatically. The breakout from Normandy, the liberation of Paris, and rapid advances across France had pushed German forces into chaotic retreat. But as U.S. troops neared the West Wall, the speed of their advance slowed. Supply lines stretched thin. Fuel shortages plagued armored divisions. Rain and mud transformed the terrain into a grinding obstacle, and the Siegfried Line, though incomplete in many sectors, stood directly in their path. The first major test came near Aachen, the first German city the Americans would attempt to seize. German forces, including seasoned infantry and newly created Volksgrenadier divisions, dug into fortified pillboxes that could withstand artillery barrages and direct tank fire. Every ridge held a machine gun nest. Every forest concealed minefields and ambush positions. American commanders understood the challenge they faced. Tanks could not maneuver easily. Infantry could not assault pillboxes without engineers. The weather, terrain, and fortifications seemed designed to bleed momentum from the Allied advance. But the U.S. Army was evolving. New coordination between engineers, infantry, and Sherman tanks allowed breakthroughs in places previously considered impossible. Combat engineers devised methods to blast open bunker doors while tanks provided suppressive fire. Infantry squads learned to flank pillboxes through forest and ravines. Still, the idea of Shermans breaking through the Siegfried Line seemed unimaginable to German troops manning the defenses. They had been told American armor was inferior, thinly armored, and vulnerable to Panzerfaust and anti-tank guns. They expected to see Shermans burn before reaching the fortifications. But what they would soon witness: Shermans smashing dragon's teeth, bulldozing obstacles, and pouring through breaches defied everything they believed about the line. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine the Western Front. To understand why the Shermans' breakthrough shocked German defenders so profoundly, it is crucial to examine the broader tactical and technological landscape of late 1944. American armored doctrine had evolved rapidly since Normandy. The M for Sherman, once criticized for its thin armor and vulnerability to German guns, was now deployed in multiple variants designed for different battlefield roles. The standard 75mm Sherman still formed the bulk of U.S. armored strength, but new models were arriving: 76mm Shermans with higher velocity guns, capable of engaging German armor at longer ranges; jumbo Sherman, heavily armored assault tanks designed to withstand direct hits while breaking fortified lines; Sherman dozer tanks, fitted with bulldozer blades to push obstacles, clear debris, and breach dragon's teeth; flamethrower Sherman, which specialized in neutralizing bunkers and pillboxes. This mix of machines created a flexible, combined arms capability that Germany had not prepared for. The Siegfried Line had been built to stop tanks, but tanks supported by engineers, coordinated infantry, and close artillery support were another matter entirely. On the German side, the situation was deteriorating. Losses in France had gutted armored divisions. The elite units were gone or severely weakened. Much of the west wall was defended by Volksgrenadiers, hastily assembled infantry units containing teenagers, older men, and wounded veterans. Their morale varied wildly. Some were fiercely loyal, while others were exhausted and disillusioned. What they did possess, however, were formidable defenses, reinforced concrete bunkers with 3 to 6 feet thick walls, interlocking fields of fire, concealed anti-tank guns, dense minefields, barbed wire belts and trenches, natural terrain advantages in forest and hills. In theory, these defenses should have forced the Americans into slow, costly assaults. And initially, they did. Early attacks near Aachen and the Hürtgen Forest became brutal, close-quarters struggles where American infantry suffered heavy casualties. But the U.S. Army adapted quickly. Engineers developed new methods to breach Dragon's Teeth using explosives, dozers, and specialized demolition teams. Artillery units learned to suppress bunker firing ports long enough for assault squads to approach. Tank infantry teamwork improved, turning the Shermans into mobile shields that allowed infantry to close in on hardened targets. Meanwhile, American logistics continued delivering overwhelming quantities of ammunition, fuel, and replacement vehicles, resources Germany could no longer match. As autumn rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire, most German commanders believed the terrain and weather would halt the American advance by itself. They trusted the Siegfried Line to hold through winter. But the Americans had no intention of waiting. They adjusted their tactic, reinforced their armored spearheads, and began coordinated offensives aimed at punching through the line once and for all. German soldiers inside the bunkers heard the first distant clatter of tank engines. With calm confidence, they had been told that no tank could cross the anti-tank obstacles ahead of them. They believed the line still held its power. They were wrong. The Shermans were coming, and they were bringing the engineers, the artillery, and the full weight of American resolve with them. The breach was inevitable. What shocked the Germans was how quickly and decisively it would happen. For the soldiers who occupied the Siegfried Line, the battle was not abstract. It was felt through trembling bunker walls, muffled artillery blast, and the claustrophobic darkness of concrete chambers sealed off from daylight. Many German troops manning these positions were Volksgrenadiers, barely trained teenagers, middle-aged conscripts, or wounded veterans reassigned from the Eastern Front. Their weapons were old, their supplies limited, and their morale already shaken by months of retreat. Yet they clung to one belief: the Siegfried Line would protect them. Inside the pillboxes, men whispered that the Americans did not have the tanks or strength to break through. The line had been described as impregnable, and these troops were ordered to defend it at all cost. Across the battlefield, American infantry and tank crews faced a different reality. They had fought through hedgerows, across open fields, and into fortified towns. Many had watched friends fall to machine gun fire pouring from concrete bunkers. They knew the Siegfried Line would be their hardest challenge yet. Yet the Americans had something the Germans lacked: momentum and overwhelming support. Infantry squads crawled through mud under artillery smokescreen. Tank commanders leaned out of their hatches, guiding Shermans toward firing ports and bunker embrasures. Engineers risked their lives to place demolition charges under enemy structures. Amid the fog and smoke, both sides fought under the weight of immense psychological pressure. For the German, it was the fear of collapse. For the American, it was the resolve to break the barrier that protected the German homeland. When the Shermans finally pushed through, the emotional impact on German defenders was immediate and devastating. The Siegfried Line was not designed to be defeated by brute force alone. Its strength came from interlocking bunkers, overlapping fields of fire, and layered obstacles intended to funnel attackers into kill zones. But American tactics in late 1944 evolved precisely to counter this. The key was combined arms coordination. Shermans could not attack the line alone. Their armor was vulnerable to hidden anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust ambushes. Likewise, infantry could not cross open ground unsupported. Engineers could not reach bunkers under direct fire. So the U.S. Army created a synchronized assault method. Artillery suppressed bunker openings and forced German gunners to shelter. Smoke screens concealed American infantry as they approached. Sherman tanks rolled forward as moving shields, firing point-blank at embrasures. Engineers advanced behind the tanks, placing charges against bunker doors or vents. Infantry squads flanked bunkers through forest or ravines to attack from blind angles. The Germans were stunned by how effectively this coordination unfolded. They expected frontal attacks. Instead, they faced a fluid assault where Shermans and infantry operated almost as a single machine. Every role supported the next. In many sectors, the Shermans played the decisive tactical role. With their mobility and dozer-equipped variants, they cleared minefields, crushed obstacles, and created new pathways through Dragon's Teeth. The line was built for a different war of static fronts and rigid defenses. But the Americans brought mobility, adaptability, and overwhelming fire support, allowing them to dismantle the West Wall one bunker at a time for months. German troops were told that the Siegfried Line would hold. It was more than a defensive structure, it was a promise that the horrors experienced on the Eastern Front would never reach German soil. Many believed that the American advance would falter at the West Wall, buying time for reinforcements or diplomatic change. So when Shermans physically broke through, the psychological impact was immense. The Dragon's Teeth iconic concrete barriers designed to stop armor were pushed aside by dozer blade Shermans or blasted apart by engineers. Pillboxes, believed indestructible, shook violently as tanks fired at close range. Entire defensive positions were bypassed by infantry slipping through gaps in the forest, German soldiers inside. Bunkers heard the grinding metal of Shermans passing behind them, something they believed impossible. Some panicked, some fled, others surrendered, convinced that if the line had fallen, the war was already lost. American units reported bunkers abandoned mid-fight, weapons scattered on the floor, helmets left behind as symbols of disbelief. The psychological collapse often happened faster than the physical breach. The shock rippled across German defensive command. The west wall, the shield of the Reich, had been breached by machines the soldiers had been told were inferior. The myth of the Siegfried Line shattered in hours. And with it, German confidence in defending the homeland. The Siegfried Line was never meant to be defeated by artillery alone. Its bunkers were reinforced with thick layers of concrete and steel. Its Dragon's Teeth massive anti-tank obstacles were designed to halt armored assaults entirely. But the Americans brought specialized technology that shifted the balance in ways German planners had not anticipated. At the heart of this capability was the M for Sherman. But not just the standard model. The Americans fielded an arsenal of variants tailored for breaching fortifications. Sherman dozer tanks outfitted with heavy bulldozer blades. These tanks pushed aside debris, collapsed roadblocks, and even uprooted Dragon's Teeth. German defenders watched in horror as obstacles they believed were immovable were shoved aside like rubble. Jumbo Shermans M for A3E2. These heavily armored Shermans absorbed direct hits from 75mm and even some 88mm guns. Designed for leading assaults, they advanced under fire to within meters of bunkers, allowing infantry to approach safely. Flamethrowers Shermans, perhaps the most terrifying weapon deployed against pillboxes. These tanks projected streams of fire into firing ports and ventilation systems, forcing garrisons to flee or surrender. Engineering support vehicless armored bulldozers, mine-clearing teams, and demolition squads formed a mechanical ecosystem around the Shermans. Their coordinated effort rendered the static defenses obsolete. The West Wall was engineered to resist the weapons of the 1930s. The Americans arrived with tools of 1944. Technology had outpaced fortification, and the Germans experienced this realization in the most shocking possible way. As their supposedly invincible defenses crumbled under industrial, mobile firepower, the breaching of the Siegfried Line was not an accident. It was the result of strategic insistence from Allied leadership, combined with aggressive operational planning by American field commanders. General Dwight D. Eisenhower recognized the symbolic and strategic importance of breaking into Germany before winter. He understood that a prolonged halt at the West Wall would give the Wehrmacht time to rebuild, reinforce, and perhaps regain the initiative. Therefore, Eisenhower pushed for pressure on all fronts. Under him, the First Army led by General Courtney Hodges was tasked with taking Aachen and breaching the neighboring fortifications. Corps commanders like J. Lawton Collins and Leonard Jarrow implemented coordinated assaults that combined infantry, armor, engineers, and artillery in new ways. Their key innovation was the deliberate assault sequence. Artillery softening of defensive sectors, infantry, infiltration into gaps and wooded areas. Sherman spearheads breaking obstacles with dozer tanks, engineers, demolishing bunkers under covering fire, rapid exploitation, widening the breach before Germans could reorganize. German commanders assumed the Americans would attack along predictable corridors. Instead, U.S. forces executed flexible, multi-axis assaults that overwhelmed static defenses. This leadership allowed American units to do what German soldiers believed impossible: turn a rigid defensive wall into a penetrable front line. The breach was not merely tactical, it was the strategic cracking of the Reich's Western armor. German military records, diaries, and post-war interviews reveal the emotional chaos that followed the Sherman's breach. Many defenders were conscripts with minimal training, placed inside fortifications they barely understood. Their officers told them the Americans would break against the line like waves on rock. Instead, the rock broke. Reports from Wehrmacht units described Shermans appearing where no tank could go, rolling through gaps in the forest, or pushing Dragon's Teeth aside. German anti-tank crews were horrified to watch their round bounce off jumbo Sherman. Others reported flamethrower tanks approaching bunker opening, forcing instant abandonment. Common phrases appear repeatedly in German accounts: the line is open. They have broken through everywhere. The Americans are behind us. The Shermans cannot be stopped. Entire companies surrendered when they realized their positions were bypassed. Some fled under cover of night, abandoning fortifications built to last decades. The shock was not merely operational, it was emotional. The Siegfried Line had been a psychological shelter for retreating German forces. Its failure shattered morale across the Western Front and when the Shermans pushed through, it marked more than a tactical win. It signaled that the war had finally reached Germany and nothing could stop it now. The breaking point came at Aachen, the first major German city the Americans would assault, and the gateway to the Siegfried Line's strongest defenses. The city was surrounded by belts of pillboxes, machine gun nest, minefield, and concrete dragon's teeth stretching across hills and forests. German commanders believed that once U.S. forces reached this position, they would be forced into a winter stalemate. But the Americans were determined to break through before the cold set in. On a gray morning in October 1944, the assault began. Artillery rumbled across the horizon, pounding German positions with relentless force. The earth shook, trees splintered, smoke rose in thick columns. Yet the bunkers reinforced with steel, and concrete absorbed the bombardment. With terrifying resilience. Then the Shermans rolled forward. Despite mud that dragged at their tracks and slopes slick with rain, the tanks advanced in tight coordination with infantry and engineers. Machine gun fire rattled from pillbox slits. Panzerfaust rockets slammed into Sherman armor. Anti-tank guns fired from concealed positions. But the Americans kept coming. The decisive moment unfolded near one of the largest fortifications protecting Aachen, a massive bunker complex blocking a key approach road. German defenders inside felt the ground trembling, not from artillery this time, but from the grinding metal of tank tracks approaching through the smoke. A jumbo Sherman led the assault, its thick frontal armor shrugging off multiple hits that would have disabled lighter tank. Behind it followed Sherman dozers, flamethrower tanks, and squads of engineers carrying explosives. The German machine gunners inside the bunker prepared for the tanks to halt, as all enemy armor had done before. But instead, the jumbo surged forward straight into the teeth of the line. It took direct hits. It kept moving. A Panzerfaust struck the glacis. The tank shook but advanced. German defenders began shouting warnings inside the bunker. Then, in a moment that stunned every soldier watching, the Sherman dozer behind the jumbo lowered its blade and physically shoved aside the first row of dragon's teeth massive concrete blocks weighing tons. The ground cracked as obstacles engineered to be immovable toppled under American steel. Engineers rushed behind the tank, placing satchel charges against the bunker's steel doors. Shermans fired point-blank into firing ports, blasting the defenders back from their weapons. The flamethrower tank advanced, spewing liquid fire into vents and embrasures. German troops inside the bunker felt heat flood the chamber. Smoke poured through cracks. The walls vibrated violently, and then silent. A white cloth appeared from the firing slit. The first major fortification of the Siegfried Line had surrendered. The breach widened quickly. Shermans poured through the gap, infantry following in waves. German defenders fled to secondary positions, shocked that the obstacles they believed indestructible had been overcome not by subtle tactic, but by relentless pressure and coordinated assault. Commanders in Aachen reported the situation with disbelief. American tanks are inside the line. The west wall has been penetrated. What began as a single breach would soon cascade into the collapse of the entire defensive system. Once the first bunker complex fell and the dragon's teeth were breached, the momentum of the American assault became unstoppable. What German commanders expected to be a slow, grinding battle devolved into a rapid unraveling of their defensive system. The breach widens. American units pressed forward with precision and aggression. Infantry squads secured the flanks while Shermans advanced through the gap, firing on secondary bunkers even before German crews inside realized their outer defenses have fallen. Dozer-equipped Shermans cleared additional rows of obstacles, widening the breach into a corridor large enough for entire armored companies to pass through. Engineers detonated charges on stubborn fortifications, creating new openings that bypassed heavily defended sections. The Siegfried Line, built to force attackers into predictable lanes, was now being opened at angles the German designers never intended. Reports from German observation posts were frantic. Multiple breakthroughs. Tanks behind us. We are surrounded. The illusion of the line's invincibility shattered. Urban combat in Aachen. Inside Aachen, the fighting was brutal. Shermans fired down narrow streets, using their maneuverability to flank bunkers that faced outward toward France. Infantry fought room to room in dense urban blocks, while engineers blasted through interior walls. To avoid exposed intersections, German commanders tried desperately to hold the city, knowing its fall would confirm that the Americans were inside the Reich itself. But the psychological shock from the breakthrough outside the city was too great. As Shermans appeared on roads the Germans believed were protected by impregnable fortifications, panic set in. Volksgrenadier units broke. Others surrendered in groups. Even hardened SS formations began falling back under the realization that the line had failed. On October 21, 1944, Aachen became the first major German city to fall to the Allies. The Siegfried Line's collapse made it possible. Shock across the Western Front. When word spread that Shermans had penetrated the West Wall, reactions across the German army ranged from disbelief to despair. For months, troops had been told that the Americans lacked the firepower and engineering capacity to break the line. Many believed the winter would force a stalemate. Buying Germany precious time. Now that hope was gone. Field reports described entire positions abandoned without orders, platoons refusing to reoccupy breached sectors, commanders shaken by the speed of the collapse. Widespread belief that the Americans were unstoppable. For the Wehrmacht already straining under shortages of fuel, ammunition, and experienced troops, the psychological blow may have been more significant than the physical defeat. The Shermans pushed deep with the breach secure. American armored divisions surged into Germany. The Shermans rolled across terrain once considered untouchable, advancing toward the Roer River. German attempts to counterattack were met with devastating firepower and precise coordination between U.S. tanks, artillery, and infantry. Positions that had taken years to construct fell in hours. Fortifications meant to withstand massive bombardment were overtaken by mobility and choreography. German soldiers who once believed the West Wall was their shield now saw it as a trap and enclosed space with limited escape. Vulnerable to armor from multiple angles, the turning point was complete. Late autumn. The Siegfried Line, Hitler's grand defensive barrier, had been breached across multiple sectors. The breakthrough at Aachen became the symbolic and strategic turning point that opened Germany's western door. From this moment onward, the war could no longer be held at the border. American Shermans were inside the Reich. The final act of the conflict had begun. The breaching of the Siegfried Line did not merely open a physical path into Germany, it altered the strategic and psychological landscape of the Western Front. German commanders had long warned that losing the West Wall would expose the interior of the Reich to invasion. What many of them failed to anticipate was how quickly the collapse would unfold. Once the first breach occurred, the West Wall loses its purpose citizen to delay an enemy for months. The Siegfried Line instead became a series of isolated pockets of resistance. The American combined arms assault had bypassed and fractured the defensive network so thoroughly that many bunkers found themselves cut off within hours. German units that had believed they were anchoring the defense suddenly discovered that their communication lines were severed. Their supply routes were in American hands. Tanks were maneuvering behind their positions. Artillery fire was coming from angles the line was not built to face. The psychological shock was profound. Bunkers that were built to project strength had become steel and concrete coffin. Some garrisons fought on out of duty or fear of retribution, but others surrendered as soon as they realized the line had been compromised. American forces exploit the breach and Shermans poured through the opening. The U.S. Army moved with remarkable speed. Infantry regiments cleared bypassed fortifications, engineers expanded the breach, and artillery units repositioned to support the deepening advance. American commanders understood that momentum was everything. If they slowed, the Germans might regroup. If they pushed hard, the entire defensive system could unravel, and push they did. Sherman tanks spearheaded thrusts toward key towns, road junctions, and bridges along the Roer River. Their mobility allowed them to outflank German strongpoints, forcing defenders to withdraw rather than risk encirclement. Each mile gained strained the collapsing German logistics network even further. German troops face harsh reality. As for German infantry, the reality was devastating. Ammunition was running low, rations were scarce. Heavy weapons were in short supply, reinforcements were either too young, too old, or too exhausted. Many troops were Volksgrenadiers who had been promised the line would protect them. When Shermans broke through, that promise disintegrated. Diaries recovered after the war reveal common theme. We were told the Americans could not cross here. The tanks came through the fog. We could not stop them. The line has failed. The war is lost. These sentiments echoed across the front. The fall of Aachen sends a message. The capture of Aachen, the first major German city to fall to the Allies, became a symbol of what the breach truly meant. Civilians witnessed American armor rolling through streets where propaganda had claimed the enemy would never set foot. German soldiers heard reports that the city's defenders had lost not due to lack of courage, but because the line itself had failed to perform its sacred function. The message was clear: if the Siegfried Line could fall, anything could fall. The psychological effect of this realization spread far beyond the battlefield. Germany's western shield had shattered, and the Allies were no longer at the gates, they were inside. The collapse of the Siegfried Line did more than open Germany's western frontier. It triggered a chain reaction that reshaped the final months of World War II in Europe. The West Wall had been the Wehrmacht's last major fortified barrier. Once it failed, every defensive plan west of the Rhine had to be rewritten. The strategic picture unraveled. Sherman High Command had relied on the Siegfried Line to buy time to recover shattered divisions, time to refill fuel reserves, time to stabilize the front. Its sudden collapse forced them into reactive posture. Field marshals scrambled to reposition units, many of them under strength, lacking vehicle, or composed of hastily trained replacements. With the Americans now operating inside Germany, even minor towns and road junctions became strategic liabilities. The Wehrmacht could no longer dictate the pace of the war. It could only respond slowly, weakly, and often too late. American momentum builds behind the Shermans pouring through the breach came the full weight of the U.S. Army. Supply convoys brought fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements directly onto German soil. Artillery units moved their guns forward, extending their firepower deep into the heart of the Reich. Engineers worked tirelessly, clearing mines, repairing bridges, and transforming the destroyed landscape into corridors of advance. Infantry divisions spread out to secure flanks while armored units surged forward, seizing key terrain before German forces could regroup. For American soldiers, the breach was more than a tactical success. It was a symbolic victory, proof that the war was entering its final phase. German morale cratered. The days following the breach, morale across the German front lines plummeted. Veterans who had survived the Eastern Front sensed an all-too-familiar pattern. Once a defensive line breaks, collapse spreads like wildfire. Captured German officers revealed a recurring sentiment: if the West Wall cannot stop them, nothing can. Propaganda could not hide the truth. Civilians saw American armor approaching towns once considered safe. Soldiers heard rumors of entire companies surrendering or fleeing. The belief in ultimate victory, a belief the Nazi regime had fought desperately to maintain, was dying. The stage is set for the Ardennes counteroffensive. Shock of losing the Siegfried Line contributed directly to Hitler's decision to launch a desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. He sought to restore confidence, split the Allied armies, and recapture the momentum lost at Aachen. But the very need for such an operation was rooted in the collapse of the West Wall. It was a gamble born from weakness, not strength. A new phase of the war begins with the Shermans' breakthrough. The Western Allies were no longer fighting at the border. They were advancing through Germany's villages, forest, and industrial regions. The war had shifted from a continental pursuit to a national invasion. The Siegfried Line, once a symbol of protection, became a reminder of how quickly static defenses could crumble under modern, mobile warfare. The breach confirmed a truth that Germany's leaders had been reluctant to accept. The Allies were not just capable of breaking into Germany, they were capable of reaching its heart. And after the fall of the West Wall, the path to the Rhine and eventually to victory lay open. The Siegfried Line was built to project permanence. Its bunkers, trenches, and dragon's teeth were meant to withstand anything an enemy could bring against them. For years, it stood as a concrete reassurance that the German heartland was safe, that even if the war turned against the Reich elsewhere, the West Wall would remain unbroken. But in the autumn of 1944, the truth became unmistakable. No wall, no matter how thick its concrete or how vast its length, could stop a force built on mobility, coordination, and relentless pressure. The Shermans that rolled through the fog outside Aachen did more than breach a defensive line. They reshaped the nature of the war itself. For the German soldiers who manned the bunkers, the sound of tank engines passing behind their positions was a moment that shattered belief. A lifetime of propaganda, promises, and indoctrination dissolved in the grinding of steel against concrete. The Siegfried Line had not held. Their final shield had fallen. For American soldiers, the breakthrough offered something different: confirmation that the struggle through France and Belgium had led to the threshold of victory. They had not merely pushed Germany back, they had crossed into its territory. The war's end, distant for so long, now felt within reach. In the decades since the fighting ended, the broken remnants of the West Wall have become relics, silent, moss-covered reminders of a time when nations built walls to stop armies. But the lesson that emerged from its collapse is far larger than its physical ruins. Static defenses, no matter how formidable, cannot withstand an enemy that adapts, coordinates, and refuses to yield. The Siegfried Line was not defeated by sheer force. It was defeated by evolution of tactics, of technology, of will. And in that moment, as Shermans broke through fortifications once believed eternal, the Western Front crossed a threshold from which the war could only move in one direction: forward, toward the Rhine, toward the end.